Welcome to Mr. Shadow's Stories. When the living world sleeps and darkness claims the hours between midnight and dawn, there are places where silence is never truly silent. Places where the boundary between life and death grows thin, and sometimes something crosses over. I am your guide through the darkness, your companion in the shadows. Tonight, I bring you tales that will crawl beneath your skin and make their home in the darkest corners of your mind. These are not fairy tales. These are not legends whispered around campfires. These are true stories from those who work in the last place any of us will ever visit. The morgue, a place of cold steel tables, fluorescent lights that hum in the silence, and bodies waiting for their final journey. But what happens when those bodies aren't quite ready to rest? What happens when morgue workers encounter something that defies every rational explanation? Tonight, 5 professionals will share their experiences, 5 stories that changed the way they see death itself. So, turn down your lights, lock your doors, and whatever you do, don't listen to this alone. Let the shadows gather, and let us begin. Story 1: The Night Shift Visitor. Our first story comes from Marcus, a morgue attendant who worked the night shift at a hospital in Portland, Oregon. Marcus had been on the job for 3 years when this incident occurred, and he considered himself unshakable. He'd seen everything, or so he thought. It was a Tuesday night in November, around 2:30 in the morning, the kind of night where fog pressed against the windows like something trying to get in. Marcus was alone in the morgue, cataloging personal effects from a body that had arrived earlier that evening, an elderly woman named Dorothy Hernandez, deceased from natural causes at the age of 73. The morgue was unusually quiet that night. Even the usual hum of the refrigeration unit seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Marcus remembers feeling uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered occasionally, something maintenance had been meaning to fix for weeks. He was labeling Dorothy's wedding ring when he heard it. Singing. Soft at first, barely audible over the ambient noise of the building. A woman's voice, frail and wavering, singing what sounded like a lullaby. Marcus froze, his pen hovering over the evidence bag. The singing was coming from inside the cold storage unit. Now, Marcus knew he was alone. The security logs confirmed it. No one had entered the morgue since his shift began at midnight. But the singing continued, growing slightly louder, more distinct. He could make out words now, though they were in Spanish, a language Marcus didn't speak fluently, but recognized. His hands trembling, Marcus approached the cold storage unit. The singing stopped the moment he touched the handle. Silence rushed back in, like water filling a vacuum. He told himself it was his imagination, that working nights was finally getting to him, but he had to check. He pulled open the drawer where Dorothy Hernandez rested. The body lay exactly as it had been positioned, eyes closed, hands folded across the chest, covered by the standard white sheet. Nothing was disturbed, nothing had moved. Marcus exhaled slowly, feeling foolish. He was about to close the drawer when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Dorothy's lips were moving. Not dramatically, not like in horror movies, just the slightest flutter, as if she were whispering words he couldn't hear. Marcus stumbled backward, his rational mind screaming that it was impossible, that it was post-mortem muscle spasms, that it was anything except what it appeared to be. But then her hand moved, just one finger lifting slowly from where it rested on her chest, pointing directly at Marcus. The finger held steady for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. Then it lowered back down, and Dorothy Hernandez was still once more. Marcus didn't wait to see if anything else would happen. He backed out of the room, grabbed his phone, and called his supervisor, demanding that someone come down immediately. When his supervisor arrived 20 minutes later, they checked the body together. Everything was normal. No signs of movement, no explanation for what Marcus experienced. But here's what makes this story truly disturbing. The next day, when Dorothy's daughter came to collect her mother's belongings, she broke down crying when she saw the wedding ring Marcus had been cataloging. She told them that her mother had always sung that same lullaby to her as a child, the lullaby Marcus had heard coming from the cold storage, the lullaby he couldn't have known. And she revealed something else. On her deathbed, Dorothy had made her daughter promise one thing. She had pointed at her wedding ring and made her daughter swear that they would bury her with it. The daughter had forgotten to mention this to the hospital staff. Marcus never worked another night shift. To this day, he believes Dorothy came back to remind them about her final wish. He just wishes she had found a less terrifying way to communicate.
Story 2: The Photographer. Sarah worked as a forensic photographer in Chicago for over a decade. Her job was to document bodies for legal and medical purposes, photographing injuries, identifying marks, and creating a visual record before autopsies were performed. She had photographed thousands of deceased individuals, and nothing had ever disturbed her professional composure. Until the night they brought in victim number 47. It was late August, sweltering even at night, when the body of a young man was brought in. He'd been found in his apartment, deceased for approximately 3 days in the summer heat. The circumstances were suspicious enough to warrant a full forensic workup. Sarah's job was to photograph everything before the medical examiner began his work. She set up her equipment as usual: proper lighting, multiple angles, attention to every detail. The young man appeared to be in his late 20s, athletic build, with no immediately obvious cause of death. As Sarah began taking photographs, she noticed something odd through her camera's viewfinder. In every shot, there appeared to be a shadow in the background that wasn't visible to the naked eye. At first, she thought it was a problem with her equipment, perhaps a smudge on the lens or a malfunction with the sensor. But when she reviewed the images on her camera's display screen, the shadow was clearly there. A dark human-shaped silhouette standing in the corner of the room. Sarah checked the corner. Nothing was there. She cleaned her lens, adjusted her settings, and took more photos. The shadow appeared in every single one, always in the same position, always watching. Growing increasingly unsettled, Sarah decided to take a photo of the empty corner itself, without the body in the frame. She pointed her camera directly at the spot where the shadow kept appearing and pressed the shutter. What she saw in that photograph still gives her nightmares. The shadow wasn't just a blur or a trick of the light. In that image, it had distinct features. The figure of a tall man in what appeared to be old-fashioned clothing, his face obscured by darkness, but his posture suggesting he was staring directly at the camera, directly to Sarah. Her hands shaking, Sarah showed the images to her supervisor. Together, they examined every photograph she'd taken. The shadow appeared in 13 of them, growing progressively closer to the examination table in each subsequent image. In the last photo Sarah had taken before stopping, the shadow was standing directly beside the body, as if leaning over it. They decided to have the body moved to a different examination room. Sarah reluctantly agreed to continue her work, this time with her supervisor present. In the new room, under fresh lighting, she resumed photographing. The shadow didn't appear in the new location. Everything seemed normal. But when Sarah was packing up her equipment, she made the mistake of looking at the final photo she'd taken in the original room, the one she'd snapped right before they moved the body. In that image, the shadow was no longer beside the examination table. It was standing directly behind Sarah. She could see herself in the frame, adjusting her camera settings, completely unaware of the dark figure looming over her shoulder. And though the face was mostly obscured, she could make out enough detail to see that it appeared to be screaming silently, its mouth open impossibly wide. Sarah requested the security footage from that night. The video showed her working alone, with no shadows, no figures, nothing unusual, except for one moment right when she'd taken that final photograph. The footage glitched, pixelating for exactly 3 seconds before resuming normally. The young man's autopsy revealed he'd died of sudden cardiac arrest, likely brought on by extreme terror. His eyes, the medical examiner noted, had burst blood vessels consistent with having seen something that frightened him to death. Sarah still works as a forensic photographer, but she never looks at her photos until she's left the morgue. She doesn't want to know what might be standing in the shadows while she works. Some things, she says, are better left unseen until you're safely in the light of day. Story 3: The Temperature Drop. Dr. James Chen was a pathologist with 15 years of experience when he encountered something that made him question the very nature of death itself. This happened in a Boston teaching hospital where James regularly performed autopsies as part of his duties. The case seemed routine at first. A middle-aged woman named Catherine Mills had died unexpectedly in her sleep. Her family requested an autopsy to determine the cause of death, hoping for answers and closure. James scheduled the procedure for a Wednesday morning, with 2 medical students observing as part of their training. They began at 9 a.m., following all standard protocols. James made his initial observations, noting them in his recorder. The medical students stood on either side of the examination table, taking their own notes. Everything was proceeding normally, until the temperature dropped. At first, it was subtle, barely noticeable, but within minutes, the examination room became frigid. Their breath began to fog in the air. One of the medical students commented that someone must have turned the air conditioning up too high, but when James checked the thermometer, it showed the room temperature at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, exactly where it should be. The thermometer on the wall told a different story. It read 41 degrees and was still dropping.
James paused the procedure, confused. The cold was becoming uncomfortable, almost painful. Frost was actually beginning to form on the metal instruments. In 15 years of performing autopsies, he'd never experienced anything like this. He decided to call maintenance, thinking there must be a malfunction with the HVAC system. That's when Catherine's body sat up. Not all the way, not like in the movies, but her torso lifted approximately 15 degrees from the table, her head rolling forward and her mouth opening as if to speak. The medical student screamed. James stumbled backward, knocking over his instrument tray with a crash that echoed through the freezing room. And then they heard it, a voice, wet and rasping, coming from Catherine's throat. "Not yet." Just those 2 words, then the body collapsed back onto the table, lifeless once more. The temperature in the room immediately began to rise, climbing back to normal within seconds. The frost on the instruments melted, leaving puddles on the floor. James stood there, his heart pounding, his scientific mind struggling to process what had just occurred. One of the medical students had fainted, the other was backing towards the door, pale and trembling. After regaining his composure, James made a decision that went against every protocol he had ever learned. He called Catherine's husband, explained that there had been a complication, and asked to speak with him about her wife's final days. What her husband told him explained everything. Catherine had been diagnosed with terminal cancer 3 months earlier. She'd refused aggressive treatment, choosing instead to live her remaining time on her own terms. But she'd made her husband promise something specific. Under no circumstances was she to be cremated. She wanted a traditional burial in the family plot where she could rest beside her parents. Her husband had agreed, but after Catherine's death, other family members had pushed for cremation, citing expenses and practicality. He had reluctantly agreed to their wishes and signed the cremation authorization forms the day before the autopsy was scheduled. Catherine was supposed to be cremated the following morning. James never completed that autopsy. He spoke with the family, explained what had happened, and strongly recommended that they honor Catherine's original wishes. The husband, shaken by the story, immediately revoked the cremation authorization.
Catherine Mills was buried 3 days later in the family plot, exactly as she'd wanted. James says he's never felt such an intense cold in any room since that day. He's never seen another body move post-mortem, despite performing hundreds of autopsies in the years since. But he learned something important that morning. Sometimes the dead have unfinished business, and sometimes they'll do whatever it takes to make sure their final wishes are heard. Story 4: The Wrong Drawer. Emily worked as a morgue technician in Seattle for 7 years before this incident occurred. Her job involved the intake, storage, and release of deceased individuals. It was detail-oriented work that required precision and respect for the dead. Emily took her responsibilities seriously and prided herself on never making mistakes, which is why what happened one night still haunts her. It was a Friday evening, just after 7 p.m. Emily was working late, organizing paperwork and ensuring everything was properly documented before the weekend. The morgue held 12 bodies that night, all properly tagged and stored in their assigned drawers. Emily had personally verified each one that afternoon.
She was at her desk, finishing up the last of her reports, when she heard the sound of a drawer opening. The metallic rumble of the refrigeration unit sliding out from the wall echoed through the empty morgue. Emily looked up from her computer, confused. No one else was there. The security log showed she was alone in the building. Standing slowly, her pulse quickening, Emily walked toward the cold storage units. Drawer 7 was extended approximately 2 feet from the wall, the drawer that should have contained the body of an elderly gentleman named Robert Patterson, deceased from pneumonia complications. Emily approached carefully, assuming the latch must have malfunctioned, but when she looked at drawer 7, her stomach dropped. The drawer was empty, completely empty. No body, no body bag, nothing. Impossible. She had verified Robert Patterson's presence just hours earlier. Bodies don't simply disappear from locked morgues. Fighting rising panic, Emily checked her logs. According to her records, no one had collected Robert Patterson. No release had been authorized. The body should absolutely be there. She checked the other drawers, thinking perhaps she'd made an error in her documentation, though she knew she hadn't. Every other body was exactly where it should be, except Robert Patterson. He was simply gone. Emily was reaching for her phone to call security when she heard footsteps, slow, shuffling footsteps coming from the hallway that led to the autopsy suites. Her blood ran cold. She knew those rooms were empty. She'd locked them herself. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Emily grabbed a scalpel from the nearest instrument tray, her hand shaking so badly she almost dropped it. The footsteps stopped just outside the doorway to the main morgue area. Silence stretched out, terrible and suffocating. Then a figure stepped into view. It was Robert Patterson, or something wearing his appearance. It stood in the doorway, wearing the same gray suit he'd been dressed in for his viewing, his skin pale and waxy, his eyes clouded with death. But he was standing, walking, moving. Emily couldn't scream, couldn't move, could barely breathe. The thing that looked like Robert Patterson tilted its head, studying her with those dead eyes. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through a graveyard. "Wrong drawer," it said. "You put me in the wrong drawer." Emily's mind raced. Wrong drawer? She had verified everything. Drawer 7, Robert Patterson, tag number matching, everything was correct, wasn't it? "I'm not Robert Patterson," the figure said, as if reading her thoughts. "Robert Patterson is in drawer 12. I'm in drawer 7. Has been for 3 weeks, waiting. You put me in the wrong drawer, and now I can't rest." With trembling hands, Emily checked her computer logs, going back through the records. Her heart nearly stopped when she found it. 3 weeks ago, there had been a data entry error. A John Doe brought in from a car accident had been assigned to drawer 7, but somehow, in the digital records, his information had been overwritten with Robert Patterson's data when Patterson arrived 2 days ago. The system showed only Patterson in drawer 7, but the physical body in that drawer was still John Doe. "Fix it," the figure whispered. "Please, I need to go home. They're waiting for me, but I can't go home from the wrong drawer. Nothing works from the wrong drawer." Then it turned and walked back down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. Emily heard a drawer slide shut with that familiar metallic rumble. With her hands still shaking, Emily called her supervisor and the medical examiner. Together, they came in that night and performed a complete audit of every body in storage. They found exactly what the apparition had told her. The body in drawer 7 wasn't Robert Patterson at all. It was John Doe from 3 weeks earlier. Robert Patterson was in drawer 12, where another body was supposed to be, creating a chain of misplacement that had started with that one data entry error. They corrected everything that night, re-tagging, re-documenting, making sure every individual was properly identified and stored in their assigned location. Within a week, John Doe was finally identified through dental records. His name was Marcus Brennan, and his family had been searching desperately for him since his accident. They were able to give him a proper burial. Emily still works in the morgue, but she now checks every drawer physically, not just digitally. She's never seen another body walk or heard another voice from the dead. But she learned an important lesson that night. For the deceased, details matter. A name, a number, a proper resting place. These things are sacred. Even the dead deserve to be seen, to be known, to be placed correctly. Because from the wrong drawer, nothing works, not even the passage into whatever comes next. Story 5, The Last Photograph. Our final story comes from Thomas, who worked as a morgue attendant in New Orleans for over 20 years. Thomas had seen everything the job could throw at him: natural deaths, violent deaths, tragic accidents, and everything in between. He considered himself unflappable, immune to the horrors that came through those doors. But every person has their breaking point. Thomas found his on a humid August night in 2023. The body arrived at 11 p.m., a young woman, approximately 25 years old, victim of a car accident on Interstate 10. Her name was Melissa Thornton, and she'd been pronounced dead at the scene. Standard intake procedure, nothing unusual. Thomas began his routine documentation, photographing identifying marks, cataloging personal effects, preparing the body for storage until the family could make arrangements. Among Melissa's personal effects was her cell phone. Surprisingly, it was undamaged, still powered on despite the violence of the crash. Thomas set it aside with her other belongings: purse, jewelry, clothing, all to be returned to her next of kin. He was finishing his paperwork around midnight when Melissa's phone chimed, a text message. Thomas glanced at it reflexively, then froze. The message preview on the lock screen read, "Did you see what I sent you? Look at the last photo." Thomas knew he shouldn't, that it was a violation of privacy, but something compelled him to look. Using a stylus to avoid leaving fingerprints, he accessed the phone's photo gallery. The last photo made his blood run cold. It was a selfie, Melissa smiling, sitting in her car. The timestamp showed it had been taken at 9:47 p.m., approximately 30 minutes before her fatal accident. She looked happy, vibrant, full of life. But in the background, in the rear-view mirror visible over her shoulder, there was another face, a pale, distorted face that definitely wasn't hers, its mouth open in a silent scream, its eyes completely black. Thomas' hands trembled as he enlarged the image. The face was clearer when zoomed in, and it was terrifying. Not quite human, not quite anything he could identify, and it appeared to be reaching forward towards Melissa, its fingers extended like claws.
He was about to close the photo when the phone chimed again. Another message from the same number. Do you see it? Do you see what was with her? Thomas set the phone down, his heart racing. Who was texting? How did they know he was looking at the photos? Another message arrived. It follows in the mirrors. It takes them when they see it. It's there now, behind you, in the reflection. Every instinct screamed at Thomas not to look, to ignore the message, to call security, to do anything except turn around. But he couldn't help himself. Slowly, moving as if through water, he turned to face the metal surface of the refrigeration unit behind him. In the brushed steel reflection, distorted but visible, he could see his own image, and behind him, standing in the doorway where nothing should be, was that same pale face from Melissa's photograph. The black eyes, the open mouth, the reaching hands. Thomas spun around. The doorway was empty, nothing there. But when he looked back at the metal surface, the reflection showed the figure closer now, right behind him, close enough to touch. His phone rang. His personal cell phone was sitting on the desk next to Melissa's. The caller ID showed no number, just a string of zeros. With a shaking hand, Thomas answered. Heavy breathing. Then, in a voice that sounded like wind through a tunnel, "It shows itself in mirrors before it takes you. Melissa saw it. You've seen it. Now it knows you can see it too." The line went dead. Thomas grabbed both phones and ran from the morgue, not stopping until he was outside in the parking lot under the bright security lights. He called his supervisor, called the police, and demanded that someone come immediately. When they arrived and reviewed the security footage, it showed Thomas working alone, talking to no one, staring at reflective surfaces as if seeing something invisible to the cameras. The footage showed no pale face, no figure in the doorway, just Thomas, growing increasingly agitated until he fled. But here's what they couldn't explain. When they retrieved Melissa's phone and checked the messages Thomas described, there were no texts. The last message on her phone had been sent at 6:30 p.m., hours before her death. The photo gallery showed no selfies from 9:47 p.m. The last photo was from 3 days earlier. Yet Thomas insists he saw them, saw the messages, saw the face in the mirror, and he noticed something else. After that night, he couldn't look at mirrors the same way. Sometimes, in certain lighting, he swears he can still see that pale face watching him from reflections, waiting. Thomas retired the next week. He now lives in a house with no mirrors. He's covered every reflective surface, even his phone screen when it's not in use. He says he knows it sounds crazy, that people think he had a breakdown, but he knows what he saw. And sometimes, late at night, his phone still rings with a caller ID showing only zeros. He never answers. He's terrified of what that voice might tell him, terrified of what he might see if he looks at his reflection while listening. Because some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and some things that show themselves in mirrors are waiting for the right moment to step through. These are the stories that morgue workers carry with them, stories they rarely share because who would believe them? Stories that changed the way they see death and life and the thin veil that separates the two. Marcus, who heard the dead sing their final wishes. Sarah, who photographed shadows that shouldn't exist. Dr. Chen, who felt the cold grip of a spirit unwilling to let go. Emily, who learned that even in death, being forgotten is a fate worse than dying. and Thomas, who saw something in the mirrors that sees him still. These are not entertainment. These are not fiction. These are true accounts from real people who work with the living meet the dead. They are warnings, reminders, evidence that death is not always the end, and that sometimes the dead have something to say. I am Mr. Shadows, and I bring you these stories from the darkness because I believe you deserve to know. The world is stranger than we're taught to believe, more terrible, more wondrous, and infinitely more mysterious. If these stories have spoken to you, if they've crawled beneath your skin and made their home in your thoughts, then join me again. Subscribe to this channel, and I will continue to bring you tales from the shadows, true stories, real experiences, the kind of darkness that walks in the world, waiting to be witnessed. Until we meet again in the shadows, sleep well if you can. This is Mr. Shadow's Stories, and the darkness is only beginning.